in Genesis, at the end of chapter 11, we get another genealogy, okay, that's connecting us from the tower to a really important individual. And that really important individual is somebody that is about to set up really the rest of the story of the rest of the story of the Bible is about to revolve around this person, who is Abraham. Now, originally, let me just say this. I'm going to call him Abraham throughout the lecture, but I just want you to know that I am aware that his name was originally Abram and that God changed his name, okay? But just for the sake of, because we're going so fast, we're just going to call him Abraham, okay? Now, so we just finished, let's orient ourselves towards Von Roberts. We just finished what Von Roberts is calling the Parish Kingdom. I would include 4 through 11 as in the Parish Kingdom because it's just showing the effects of sin. And now we're going to get into what's called the Promised Kingdom with Abraham. Have I got that? Now, here's the deal with this story. The camera is about to zoom in. So in other words, these first 11 chapters of Genesis, wide-angle lens, looking at really all of humanity. But now we zoom in on one family, one man, just in chapter 12, and we're going to follow that, okay? So why the zoom in? Well, let's look at the first words. So if you got your Bible, I'm going to need another reader. Let's look at the first words to Abraham. And these first words that we see to Abraham are actually some promises that God gives him that become part of what's called the Abrahamic covenant. But before we get there, let me show you this. This is I'm going to give you a few dates throughout the course of the semester. Just for those of you, I'm only going to give you like 6 for the Old Testament, so don't panic. You're not going to have a bunch of dates. But I just do this because I know some of you think real well chronologically, and so having some dates helps you. And let me just say this, you don't have to write this chart because it's on Campus Web on our handouts. Everybody got that? So you can just download all the dates at one time on Campus Web on our handouts. But Abraham would have been around 2100. CA means 2100. CA means around, circa. 2100 BC. Now, if you're not familiar with how BC and AD work, BC is like negative numbers. And I know all of you love math, so I know negative numbers resonate with your soul. It's like your love language. So I got like 2 nods. So here's the deal. Keep in mind with a negative number, the lower the number, the later in time. Everybody got me? So we're going to be counting down. So Abraham's 2100 BC, so we'll go down and we'll get later in time until we get to the life of Christ, then we switch to AD. Okay? Everybody got that? So 2100 BC, so around 2,000 years before Christ comes on the scene is Abraham's life. So just keep that in mind. All right, so now let's talk about this covenant that I talked about. So the Abrahamic covenant. So have you guys ever tried to watch a 3D movie without 3D glasses? What's that experience like? It hurts. It's very weird. I heard weird, hurts, and I would also use the phrase distorted. Would y'all agree with that? Bottom line is it just wasn't meant. 3D movie's not meant to be watched except 3D lens, right? 3D glasses. Many people struggle with putting the story of the Bible together. Obviously, that's the purpose of this class. But what many people don't realize is that the reason they have a hard time understanding the Bible is because they don't have a knowledge of some key events that really play out in the rest of the story. And of all the events, all the things that a person needs to know to be able to understand the rest of the Bible story, this would rank at the top. So in other words, if you don't have a knowledge of the Abrahamic covenant and you try to read the Bible, it would be like trying to watch a 3D movie without 3D glasses. That's how significant and how important the Abrahamic covenant is. So since it's so significant, let's start talking about it a little bit today, and then we'll finish in the next class period. Will you read Genesis 12, chapter 12, verses 1 through 7? Chapter 12, verses 1 through 7. So here we have Genesis 12, 1 through 7, and this is kind of God's initial promises to Abraham. Now later he's going to, in chapter 15, he's going to what we might call, it's called ratify the covenant. And that's where he's going to kind of officially enter into covenant with Abraham. I don't know if you guys remember this from your reading, but this is when there was that like a burning fire pot and Abraham had to put the dead animals and the fire pot passed through them. That was a ceremony where God was basically sealing the deal, so to speak, on the covenant He's making with Abraham. But in this chapter, we're getting the initial promises. So if we think about this covenant that God made with Abraham, what are the three really kind of components? The three things, there was a lot in that passage, but how would we summarize them into three big categories or promises that God made? Okay, good. Great name, which I'm going to connect to another thing there. Bless, yeah. That's right. Great. So we're going to come back to that. That's my last point. So sorry, this PowerPoint kind of messes up. There was 5 times it said bless. And so remind me to come back to that if I forget. Okay, so we got, and I would tie the name great to that one. So I'd put those two together just for the sake of summary, but those are two important ones. And remember, the name, making your name great, plays off of the previous chapter where the tower builders tried to make themselves a name. Okay? What else? Okay, the land of Canaan, that's big. He promises him offspring to make him a great nation. Okay? So this is kind of the idea that God is saying to Abraham, I'm going to give, out of you, I'm going to make a great nation. Later on in the passage, not in the passage, but in the Abraham story, God uses 2 kind of metaphors to describe how great He's going to make Abraham's offspring, how many, how numerous. Does anybody know what those are? Sand on the seashore and stars in the heaven. And the point of both isn't that you should go out and count the sand on the seashore, and that's how many. The point is that He's going to give him innumerable descendants. Okay? So that's the first part, offspring. He's going to make you into a great nation, innumerable descendants. The second one is the one that you guys, several of you said, and that's the land promise. And this is the promise that He's going to give him a specific land. In fact, this is why this is the last verse. Abraham's standing in the land of Canaan, and God says, to you I'll give this land. Okay? So the land is huge. Because this land becomes a very important focus for the whole Old Testament. So let me just show you real quick. Did y'all get that? The map. It's really light, but can you guys see like this solid line and this dotted line? Y'all seeing this? Okay. So from maybe Western Civ, you might remember this. This right here over here is the Persian Gulf, and then there's the Euphrates, and there's the Tigris. What's this area called right here that kind of runs like this? The Fertile Crescent. And then over here is the Mediterranean Sea. So this little strip of land right here by the Mediterranean Sea would be the land of Canaan. That's the land that God was giving Abraham. But who was in the land at the time? The Canaanites. Okay? But if you look right here, there's a dotted line. So what happens is, if you jump back in chapter 11 of Genesis, Abraham's father, Terah, actually moved the family up to this place called Haran. Okay? And it was from Haran that Abraham then moved down to the land, to Shechem was a city that he moved to. So we see here that Abraham's origin is way over here in Mesopotamia, and this is called Ur of the Chaldeans. Okay? So like in Babylon, this is the area of Babylon. Okay? So we can see that Abraham migrated all the way across the Fertile Crescent over there. So that's going to be important. Let me look at that. And then the last promise is the one that we said, I think, first, and it was actually the most obvious. And this is the idea of blessing. Now notice I have in parentheses, to the nations. Blessing to the nations. So here, 2 things I want to say about blessing. One is, notice how many, he repeated blessing five times in this passage. He says bless, bless, bless 5 times. What's significant is, if you were to go back and look at Genesis 1 through 11, you would see that there were 5 curses, 5 things or people cursed in Genesis 1 through 11. So what that parallel, the blessing in response to the curses does for us, is it actually highlights the important and integral connection between the Abraham story in Genesis 1 through 11. Now this is significant because many people, when they read the Old Testament, they say, oh, that's not my story, that's Israel's story. And the problem is they miss this connection right here. Abraham, God's call of Abraham and these promises are a direct response to the rebellion of humanity in Genesis 1 through 11. In other words, Abraham is the solution to the sin problem. You remember last time we said it's like a wildfire, it's out of control, this unbridled power of sin that's spreading. How's God going to stop it? Well, His answer begins with Abraham. And he's going to take what was cursed and he's going to reverse it and bring blessing through Abraham. Okay? Now, oftentimes when we think of blessing, both in the Bible and in our own lives, I think we think of blessing as like a swimming pool. And here's what I mean. When we usually think of blessing, especially as Americans, we think of it selfishly, like it's me, I'm storing it up. So if God blesses me a lot of money, I build it up in my bank account, right? It's me, I collect it. Blessing is something that we collect. Oftentimes is what we think about. But actually, this verse and numerous times through the Bible, the paradigm is actually not the pool analogy. The better analogy would be a pipeline. So in other words, God blesses people so that they can be a blessing to others. This is the Abrahamic covenant. If you notice verse 3, he says this, "And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So that's why I have in parentheses here, the blessing on Abraham is to the nations. So this reiterates what we've talked about. God's heart has always been and will always be for the nations. Okay, and so Abraham was to serve as a pipeline. As God blessed him, he was to pass that blessing on to the nations around him, all the families of the world. And the cool thing is that as God's people, the church today, we have the same task. We have been blessed by Christ in salvation. Ephesians 1 says that we have every spiritual blessing in Christ in the heavenly places. And Christ has commanded us to go and make disciples of who? All nations. And so therefore, as we make disciples, we are taking the blessings we have been given and extending those to others. That's the biblical paradigm for God's blessing on people's lives. He blesses them so that they might bless others. And this, once again, is another key connection between Genesis 12 and Genesis 11. Because you remember, 1 through 11. Genesis 1 through 11, camera zoomed out on the nations. And now Genesis 12 doesn't leave the nations behind, but connects Abraham back to those very nations. Now, here's the deal on this. Do these categories look familiar? So we just said it earlier, but we didn't say these words. Yes, yeah. God's people. That's why I put them in this order, by the way. I would have put blessing first, but it didn't fit Von Roberts. So God's people in God's place under God's own blessing. So you see Von Roberts is doing what I just said the Abrahamic covenant did. He's showing how the Abrahamic covenant, if you understand the Abrahamic covenant, it becomes a paradigm through which, or a pattern through which you can understand all of Scripture. That's what's key to understand here. So this is Von Roberts. He's just taking it. Well, actually, Von Roberts didn't come up with that definition. That's Graham Goldsworthy. But Graham Goldsworthy just took that definition based on the Abrahamic covenant and made it where you can see it run throughout all Scripture. Okay, here's the question I have for you. We are about to now jump into the life of Abraham. But I want to ask you a question before we jump into Abraham's life and finish it today. Of these three components, now you guys read Abraham, his life Monday. So of these three components, do you remember the story of Abraham? Which one would you say is the most prominent? Okay, they're all three in Abraham's story. But which one gets the most attention in Abraham's story? Yes, great job. You read. That's great to hear. Easily, right? I mean, almost half his life is he's dealing with what question? Yes. Yeah, where's this kid you promised me, God? I mean, God promised to make him a great nation. He can't even have one kid. You know, so he's in a bit of a pickle, okay? So let's talk about the promise of the offspring. Hey, now to set this up, let's do this. At your table, I just want you real quick to share, and you two can just... here's the question I have for you. This is going to set up our this discussion. What is the longest that you have ever had to wait to receive something that you were promised? Now, my intention here is not to cause bitterness towards your parents in any way, but I always get some angry people at their parents. So I'm not worried about it. I just want you to think, what's the longest you've ever had to wait to receive something that you were promised? Abraham, the reason I pose this question is because Abraham, most of you I think are under 25. Abraham was promised something that he didn't receive for 25 years, okay? So I wanted to put that in perspective. Could you imagine waiting some of you are like, I'm almost there. Can you imagine waiting 25 years for something that you were promised, okay? That's Abraham. He was promised a son when he was 75, those initial covenant promises, and he received the son when he was 100. Okay? So,
Like the oldest person.
yeah, it's old. That's right. Well, that's what's good. We're going to talk about. That's what makes it so amazing. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. Abraham, though, he had to wait 25 years, but I want to get a little deeper. He didn't have an easy wait. And so what I want to do is kind of do just an overview real quick of Genesis 12, Abraham's life really, and highlight to you kind of the journey and the obstacles Abraham had as far as seeing that promise come to fruition. Okay? So let's start first of all by talking about obstacles in the way of him receiving that promise. So it's kind of like if you're running track. Abraham just didn't have to run around the track for 25 years. He had to run around the track jumping hurdles for 25 years. Does that make sense? And so let's talk about what some of those obstacles were. Okay, you guys tell me, what are some obstacles or roadblocks that Abraham had that had to be overcome in order for for him to see Isaac's birth? Age. But whose age? Who's Sarah? Yeah, his wife. By the way, again, we're going to call her Sarah, but she was Sarai. Okay. But Sarah. Okay, Sarah eventually got to the point where it says that she was past the childbearing age. Now, this is not biology class. I'm not going to tell you all what that means. Okay, you know what it means. She couldn't have babies anymore, right? But even before that, what was the problem?
She was barren.
Yeah, even before she got past the age of bearing children, before that she was barren. God had closed her womb, like she couldn't have babies. So that's a major problem when you're supposed to have like multitudes, as many as the sand on the sea. You know, it kind of gets a problem. All right, so that's two of them y'all hit. Good. Can anybody think of another one? The other two are probably a little more less. They're more culturally related. The first one is Sarah in danger. Do you guys remember this? There's two times, one in chapter 12 and one in chapter 20, where Abraham has to sojourn, or in other words, he has to journey to a foreign country. And when he's in the country, he does what, ladies, every dream husband would ever do. He just throws her under the bus, right? I was being sarcastic. All right, so in both cases, he says what to her? Yes, tell them you're my sister, because he was scared of his life. Why was he scared of his life? She was beautiful, right? And again, the ancient world's not like the modern world. You go into a foreign country, you have a beautiful wife, the king wants your wife, you know what he does? He just kills you. And he takes your wife and puts her in his harem. Okay? That's yeah, well, they don't care about that. They just kill him, get him out of the way. So he's trying to save his own skin, so he puts her in danger. And how does this danger, though, let's get in more particular, relate to the promise of the offspring, though? And this is where the ancient context is going to be important. They just didn't take her because they're like, oh, she'd make a good maid in my kitchen. They took her and put them in their harem. What's the harem? The concubines. You know what a concubine was in the ancient world? It's like a it's like a second tier wife. It's almost, I mean, okay, I'm not going to say it that way. I'll put it a different way. The concubines existed just for the pleasure of the king, okay? And so in the ancient world, a king's power was oftentimes kind of displayed by the size of their harem. In other words, how many concubines they had. So these kings weren't just taking Sarah, just so she can have go work. They were taking them for that purpose, the concubine type purpose, why was that put the promise in jeopardy? Especially in chapter 20, when Abimelech takes her. Because if she goes into the harem of the king, then it's questionable who the father is of the child that's born. You get this? You see where I'm going with this? So Sarah is in danger that way. The second one is the one that's really obvious, but not natural for us to connect it to. But I want to make this connection because they come up important in several places in the Old Testament. And that is what is famine. And the famine is what actually drove Abraham to Egypt in chapter 12, where he got in trouble with Pharaoh, or where Sarah got in trouble with Pharaoh. Now, this is rather obvious, okay? I'm not trying to be pedantic, but if you're in a famine, why might that be an obstacle to having kids?
Because there's no food.
And if there's no food, you die. And if you're dead, you get the point now. If you're dead, you're not having kids, right? That's just a kind of a fact of life. Okay, so famine's big. And you say, that's kind of fuzzy. Well, actually, there's another story later in Genesis where famine's going to be connected to the theme of the offspring. And then there's a whole book later in the Bible where famine is connected to the offspring. So if you're in the Old Testament and you see a famine, be looking for the theme of offspring because they're usually hand in hand. Okay, so famine. And then the other two are the ones you've already named, which are the obvious ones. Sarah was barren. Okay, and Sarah was old, past the age of childbearing. So barrenness and age. And you could probably, the text doesn't emphasize this, but you could probably throw Abraham in there on the age as well. He was pretty old himself. The next one is this. Here we go. Let's talk about the journey. Let's talk about Abraham's journey with the promise. Okay, so what I want to do here is kind of fill in some gaps that we didn't talk about with the obstacles, basically. Okay, so let's just think about this. So first of all, he gets the promise in chapter 12. Well, then God appears to him in chapter 15 actually to ratify the covenant like we talked about earlier. But as he's doing that, Abraham raises the question and basically tells God, you haven't given me anyone, but Eliezer, the Damascene, who's from Damascus, and he's my servant. And so Abraham's like, I guess he's the one. And God says, no. Okay, he says, Eliezer is not going to be your heir. Because he was thinking, who's going to be the heir, who's going to receive the promise. So then Abraham knew it had to be his child. Everybody got this? So it can't be your servant because it has to be your child. So that's when him and Sarah devised this plan, which seems really weird to us, but was common in the ancient world. I know we got to get our minds back in the ancient world. It doesn't make it right, but it was but it was common, and that is, it's basically they had this idea. Sarah had this maidservant named Hagar, and she gave the maidservant to Abraham, and they had relations, and they had a baby named Ishmael. But then God said, on that as well. He then basically, what he does is he tells them it has to come from Sarah. The child has to come from Sarah. So this really kind of backs Abraham in a corner, right? So here in this one, him and Sarah kind of try to work some human ingenuity and figure out a way to have a child since Sarah was barren. God says, that's not how we're going to do it. And then he says, the child of promise, the child that's going to inherit the promises of the covenant, has to come from Sarah. Okay? So then we get, finally, yes, that's when Sarah laughs. That's how Isaac gets his name. Sarah laughs. And Isaac means he laughs. Okay? Because they say whenever anyone hears this, they will laugh. Okay. So eventually, Isaac is born in chapter 21. And again, Abraham is 100 years old and Sarah is 90 years old. And they live happily ever after. Correct? No. What happens next? He says, sacrifice him. Okay? So this is Abraham's test. Okay? So here's the deal. This painting up here actually is pretty representative. We think that it happened when Isaac was a baby. Actually, if you read the story, that doesn't make sense because he carried the sticks. But it's just a good reminder that Isaac was older. He was a young boy when God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Now, here's the big question we need to ask. Later in this class, we're going to talk about child sacrifice. Okay? And what does God think about child sacrifice? Yeah, yes, we're going to see in class, it makes him angry. One of the things that makes him very, very angry is child sacrifice. So here's the question. Did God intend for Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? No. How do we know that from the very beginning of the story? And the chapter begins by saying, and God tested Abraham. So we're told, so here's the deal. As readers, here's the cool thing about the Bible, by the way. As readers, we have more inside information than the characters did when the stories actually took place. Abraham has no idea that it's a test, okay? But we as the reader know it's a test, and therefore know God's not desiring for him to actually kill his son Isaac. But it is a test of Abraham's faith to see, here we go, if he is willing to sacrifice the very promise that he's been waiting 25 years on. So to go back to your discussion, it would be like if you actually got the promise that you've been waiting so long on, and then you immediately had to give it back. Maybe the bike doesn't work well, but it was actually something you received. Imagine receiving something that you really wanted, that you've been waiting on for 25 years, and then you get to enjoy it for a few days, and then you have to give it back. That would be hard, right? And that's the point here. It's a test of Abraham's faith to see if he's willing to give up, to sacrifice his son, the son of promise that he had been given. And he passes the test, by the way. Those of you who don't remember the story, he passes the test. And as a result, God reaffirms the covenant with him. And it really is kind of the culmination of the whole story of Abraham. So here's the question. The question is, as we look at the big picture here, there's something that kind of rises to the top about this story, besides the offspring, which we're going to keep picking back up by Friday. But there's something else that kind of comes to the surface in this story that is absolutely astounding, but that we can miss. And that is what later biblical authors always connect Abraham to. And some of you have read the Bible enough to know that any time in the New Testament Abraham comes up, he comes up in what? A positive or negative manner? It's always positive, and it's always he is the premier and supreme example in the Bible of what character, what quality? Faith. Abraham is the man of faith in the Bible. Hands down. So, what Paul and James both do with Abraham is they present him as the model for us as believers. And Genesis 15:6 is this key verse. This is when God appears to him and kind of reiterates the promise of the offspring. This was the little story about Eliezer. Here's what he says. And he, the he there is Abraham, believed the Lord, and he, that's the Lord, counted it to him as righteousness. Okay, here's the deal with Abraham. Abraham, was he perfect? No. Okay, if you say yes, then you missed the story. He is not perfect. He blew it many times in many ways. Okay, like we said, the biblical characters, the biblical writers are all too happy to show the flaws of the biblical characters. And Abraham blows it several times, so we're not talking about perfection here. But what this is showing us is that because Abraham put his faith in Yahweh and in God, in the promises that God had given him, God counted that. It's kind of like, think about bank terminology, like you get a credit to your account, right? So you open up your online bank account, and my credits are bold and in a different, I'm colorblind, so I think they're red, but I could be wrong. Maybe they're green. Anyway, they're bold. I know that. And so I like to see the bold credits on my bank account. And what happens is Abraham trusts in God, and as a result, God credits him to his account righteousness. And do you remember from last class period, why is righteousness so important? Please, come on. Noah. What does righteousness get you in Genesis? So, there you go. Salvation, and to put it in a little more on the negative side, escape from God's wrath. You remember this? Righteousness spares you from God's wrath. That's why, you remember I talked about Romans, when Paul's building his argument in Romans 4, when he talks about how to get righteousness, we have to put our faith in Christ. Guess who he uses as example? Abraham. So just like Abraham, when we place our faith in Christ, we get a credit to our account also of righteousness. And it's Christ's righteousness, okay? So that's the parallel that comes out in the biblical story. Now, here's the deal. If you think about Abraham waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting to receive what he's promised, his life really does parallel the life of the Christian life, right? In Hebrews chapter 11, it's this really cool section. I think I have time to read it. In Hebrews 11, 8 through 16, where it talks about Abraham's faith. And let me just read it real quick and make a comment. It says, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out of a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward, here's the key, to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. I'm going to skip down to verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they have been thinking of the land from which they have gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. And therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Now, we as Christians, if you're a Christian, we have been promised many things from God relating to our faith and our future. And I don't have time to go through all those because there are a myriad of them. But one thing that we've been promised that Abraham in this passage was also promised, and that is a city whose foundations are built by God. And that is, we've been promised a new heaven and new earth at the end of the Bible. And just like Abraham, the way we exercise faith is we keep our eyes on that future promise. And what that allows us to do in life now is it not only gives us hope, but by keeping our faith in that future city, that future promise that God's going to fulfill one day, it also enables us to live a faith-filled life and to overcome obstacles and various trials that present themselves in our own lives. So Abraham is a model of how we not only come to salvation, but Abraham is also a model of how we live that salvation on a daily basis, and that is, we live by faith in the future. As Christians, we are a future-oriented people, but it's not like some future orientation that has no impact on the present. In other words, we have a major impact on the present because we are future-oriented, and that we know that our present circumstances are not the final word. The final word is that one day God's going to make this place new, a new heaven and new earth where righteousness dwells and where there will be no sin and suffering.